Hello, everyone. This is episode number 11 of the World War II Daily Podcast with your host, Samuel De Corti, and me, Pietro. After a long wait, we're excited to bring you the 11th episode of our show. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, someone who has been part of my journey into understanding World War II. His insights have profoundly shaped my perspective on many aspects of the events that unfolded during that time. Our guest and I share a common mission to ensure that the story of the Brazilian expeditionary to ensure that the story of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force is not forgotten. We work to bring the memory of these heroes back to life, not only in Brazil but also internationally. It is a way to honor those who left our shores to fight in the cold mountains of Italy during World War II. The FEB's little disclaimer here, I'm going to call again the FEB, which stands for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, and not BEF, because we don't want to get confused with the British Expeditionary Force. We're going to keep FEB. That is the abbreviation in Portuguese, okay? So the FEB's story was overlooked for many years, but now we have the opportunity to revive it and share how a Latin American nation sent its soldiers overseas to confront the Axis powers. I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Cesar for joining us today and for lending his expertise to this important conversation. He's my go to authority on the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, and it's both an honor and a privilege to have him here. I'm certain that Samuel is just as eager as I am to delve deeper into the remarkable story of this distant nation that played an important role in the fight against a common enemy of freedom. Before we get started, don't forget that this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Deezer, and Amazon. Be sure to like, subscribe, and engage with us. It really helps the project. For daily World War II content and updates about the show, follow us on Instagram at World War II underscore daily and at Samuel.decorti. Links will be available on the description of the episode. With all that said, let's introduce my good friend Cesar. Cesar Campiani Maximiano was born in São Paulo in 1971, earned his PhD in history from the University of São Paulo in 2005. He has taught at public and private universities, as well as at the Brazilian Army Command and General Staff College, where he was appointed professor honoris causa in 2024. He is the author of several books and articles on military history published on both sides of the Atlantic, including the Brazilian Expeditionary Force 1943 to 1945 by Osprey Publishing, along with Ricardo Bonalume Neto. Right? So, Cesar, be welcome to the World War II Daily podcast with me and Samuel De Corti. Um, I think that the intro summarizes really well your work because it was you sent me. So I don't think if you want to add something, just do it. No? Okay. Um, so carry on. Let's carry on. So how did you get interested in World War II? How did it all start?
Well, thanks for the invitation. As you mentioned, I was born in the 70s, in the early 70s. The memory of World War II was still very much close uh, on TV. You saw documentaries and, uh, you know, uh, the images of the parades with thousands of World War II vets during our National Day commemorations are still alive for a very long time for me, even after so many years. I had a great uncle who took part in the division. In newspaper stands, you could find uh, popular history books all over. In fact, we had the series translated to Brazil translated in Brazil, that is called here Hennes Books, that very popular history book series. Uh, I don't recall its name in English, but they had all titles separated by campaigns, weapons, units, with authors such as John Keegan, Kenneth Maxwell. So World War II in the 70s here was something that was really big, even without the internet, and we had a military regime by that time, which made constant allusions to the fact that the Brazilian army had participated in the Italian campaign as well as the Air Force and Navy in our Southern Atlantic campaign. So it was a strong part of official discourse to keep bringing the subject of World War II quite often, as I said, in its official propaganda. Later on, also because my parents were kids from the 40s, they got very much as the same impression. They grew up with their parents, with their relatives, with their neighbors, talking about their war experiences, even if we didn't suffer direct attacks on our land. Okay, the war got very close because young men were conscripted. We had to keep the literal well defended. A lot of people from my neighborhood were inducted into the army. So even if we didn't get directly attacked on our major cities, uh, the memory of the war was close. That might sound a bit strange to people who lived on countries which were directly affected, which were bombed. But even in the cities, the big cities on the coast, the northeastern coast, Rio de Janeiro and Santos, where you have the major harbors, the risk of attacks was felt. There are German U-boats sank right here close to São Paulo in the uh, areas close to Ilhabela, Santa Catarina. So it was in some ways a closer experience. Later on, in view of all these influences, I always like history. It's a childhood interest. So I started to read uh, about the subject, and I realized that there were not so many information about so much information about the experience of the average Brazilian soldier. You found a lot of official books, uh, the war correspondence books, a little bit of documentaries on TV, but the memoirs, the frontline soldiers' experience was something that was quite difficult to reach. Later, I discovered why. Most of their books were self-published or printed in very small numbers. So when I started my history undergraduation course, from the outset, I decided I was going to uh, go deeper into this subject, and I started visiting my great uncle and a lot of his companions at the local association, which was quite big. That was by the early 90s. We had about, out of the 25,000 original members of the expeditionary force, we had maybe 18 to 15,000 still alive. And in São Paulo, you could find thousands of them, which were readily accessible. They were eager to talk. Most of them were eager to talk about their war experiences. I managed to record a large number of interviews, copy their photographs. Unfortunately, we didn't have the technology such as now. I used K7 tapes, digital cameras. I only wonder what could have been done if I had a cell phone back then.
All right. Very good. So for us to start, like for real, when we were working on the questions, I thought it was very important for the audience and for people abroad to understand what was the context that Brazil was inserted um, before and during the beginning of the war. So, what was the political context that Brazil was inserted and how did they come up with the Brazilian Expeditionary Force? How did it happen?
Well, Brazil had been ruled by a dictatorship since 1930. The previous government had been overthrown due to its unsatisfactory conduction of social and economic issues. And if you look at a map of the Americas, you get an answer for the second part of the question. So even if Brazil was not a democratic country by then, we were under the influence of what American foreign policy called the Western Hemisphere. And Brazil was considered a major source of raw materials, as well as it was discovered in the late 30s, a jump off point for the operations, not only in North Africa, but in Southern Europe as well, and the Middle East. So there was a major route of supply and evacuation of wounded from the theaters of operations that used a lot of important geographical points in our northeastern shores. Also, the Kriegsmarine tried to interrupt navigation of raw supplies, which were sent to North America. So these bases were used for conducting anti-U-boat operations, as well as a supply route for the uh, more distant theaters of operation. And of course, this didn't happen suddenly. The result of Brazil joining the Allies was the major Brazil joined the Allies as a result of the major arrangements made previously all along the 30s. So it was not something so sudden. Even if there was some sympathy by some of the government officials, some of the leading generals of the army, of other armed forces, even if there was some sympathy for Germany, much of it was due to their admiration of German military effectiveness, not specifically because of the German regime. Okay, so this does not explain yet why they decided to send an expeditionary force. In fact, the original idea was to send 4 divisions, 1 armored and 3 infantry with supporting units, but only eventually only 1 was materialized due to the shortage of logistical supplies, due to the difficulty of medical selection. Brazil in the 40s was a country which had 70% of its population in rural areas. So the country was not very well connected. It was difficult for the draft to reach and to examine all these thousands of men. They ended up with 108,000 medical inspections, out of which they selected 25,000 men for the initial contingent, which was shipped into 5 different echelons. They wanted to send more, but as I said, it was nearly impossible because naval transports were committed to other uh, missions. The material, the American supplies and weapons were not readily available for training. The Americans managed to send only 50% of the weapons needed to train the division. And as the echelons shipped overseas, this half allotment of weapons, which were part of the TOE of the infantry division, remained in Brazil. So the troops shipped overseas without weapons, they had to familiarize themselves with them even more as they reached the theaters. of operation. So it was something, not perfectly executed. As motivation for the interest of sending the division, that can be attributed to two factors. Uh, One which was more, structural, which was the Brazilian leadership desire, both army and civilian, to improve its army, to enhance its defense capabilities, and a more conjunctural reason was rivalry with Argentina. So you can uh, take into consideration that were two major factors which finally led to the formation of the division and its shipping overseas, which was conducted under extreme difficult conditions because the Brazilian army was not up to date in relation to how the war was being fought in Europe. They didn't have as many automatic weapons. They did not conduct field maneuvers often. Most of the troops remained under their conscription time for 1.5 years without doing much field exercises, without shooting practices often. So it was more an army for social control than properly a defense-oriented army. And that was one of the reasons the military leadership wanted to seek out modernization, new weapons, so they could transform that army, which was inherited from the old republic, from the final years of the empire, from a social control instrument to a proper defense resource.
Right. And I've never thought about it. It's just 40 years after the fall of the
Sorry, I
empire,
remember
right?
the name of the series. Sorry for interrupting. It was from Ballantine Books. The whole Ballantine books, not the whole, but most of it was translated in Portuguese, and you could find it everywhere. I don't know if there is anyone a bit older than me that didn't have at least one of these in their home libraries. Sorry, Pietro.
Nah, no, that's okay. I was just wondering that 1930s are just 40 years away from the fall of the empire. I was like, yeah, it's not.
Yes.
It's 1889, right? But anyways, you said like the effort to create the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was tremendous. And we all who are familiarized with the story, we know that. But for people out there, I would like you to explain how did they come up with this patch here that of course gave the name the smoking snakes to them.
There is not one certain factual version of the story. If you talk to 10 different veterans, they would give 15 different accounts. But it was said back then that it was easier to see a snake smoke in a pipe than the Brazilian division shipping overseas. So when they shipped out to Europe, they had an original badge, a shoulder badge, which was a green shield only with the word Brazil embroidered. And once in contact with the US divisions, they saw that each had a particular shoulder patch which represented the fighting spirit of each unit. And it was due to a suggestion from the liaison officer of the 1st Infantry Division, I mean the Brazilian 1st Infantry Division, with the 5th Army, that a particular badge for the Brazilian division was created. He suggested that this motto, it was the snake is going to smoke or the snake is smoking, should be used as an inspiration for the patch, and it really, it was uh, a major hit with the troops. Everybody liked it. They started to paint it on their helmets, on their guns, on jeeps, and all kinds of vehicles. So it got really popular, and even now it's a readily recognizable expression in Brazil, though most people can't refer to its origin. It has joined our popular jargon. If you see someone saying the snake's going to smoke, everybody knows that's going to be something uh, of a fight going on soon. But not everyone can relate it to the proper origin.
Yeah,
Out of oh,
yeah. Go ahead, Samuel, please.
out of curiosity, like you mentioned that they painted it on vehicles and they put it on their weapons and helmets. Could you share some images with us? We'll include them in the podcast episode because I think
Yes,
that the audience would certainly love to see it.
sure. I was thinking about that. I'm going
Yeah.
to send some reels and images.
I
Sure.
will. I
I,
will
I can
share.
share them with you via WhatsApp, Pietro. Is there
Yeah.
a problem with that? Okay.
No, no. You share with me, and we include in the show. I will share right now my screen here to show the original patch. That. Oops. Yeah, that would be the original patch. I wanted to not this one. Let me go back here. Stop sharing. Where? Stop. Okay. Let me share. Uh. Okay, Janela here. Yeah, this would be the original patch, right? The heart of Brazil that they went using to Italy, right? And then they switched to the smoking snake later. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so that would be the one that they were using before the smoking snake. All right. I would like to mention that we have an entire episode not only about the myth of the Free Brave of Montesi, but also the battles of the PBY Catalinas against the German U-boats here on the coast of Brazil. You can check it out in our list of episodes here on the World War II Daily podcast. Topics that are also related to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. All right. So, um, Brazil goes to Italy. They arrive there. The Brazilian soldiers they arrive there. And how does the baptism of fire happens for the FEB? Like regarding that, they didn't have the proper equipment. They weren't trained with that modern American equipment. So how does the baptism of fire happens for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force?
As I mentioned, the division was shipped in three different echelons. Then two additional echelons arrived in Italy in November 44 and February 45 with the replacement depots and some other logistical units. But the first units to ship was 6th Infantry Regiment, which was organized into a regimental combat team for their debut in the Arno River Valley sector. So they were deployed to a quiet sector of the Four Corps frontline, where they gradually acquired combat experience. They underwent a period of additional 2 weeks training in Italy. Uh, they were embedded with a few experienced units like 34 Infantry Division, 442nd Nisei Regiment. A few officers and non-commissioned officers spent a period of time in these units so they could accustom themselves with frontline conditions and then share their experiences with the other members of their companies and battalions. And as weeks passed, they were sent to more active parts of the front until they eventually reached the Gothic line proper. Germans were exchanging space for time. They were retreating, and consolidating their stronger positions, because I don't think all sectors of the Gothic line were ready by September 1944, even if they started construction around mid 1943. But they did have time, the Brazilians did have time to accustom themselves with front conditions, suffering a few casualties, executing patrol duties, which was normal for any newbie division. At least in Italy, at this period of the war, we know that it did happen this way in other fronts, but at least the first regiment to be committed to combat was lucky to be able to enter the front line under these conditions, which sadly was not the same with the other two regiments, which were, directly sent to the more active part of the Gothic line during the last offensive of 1944. By then, Fifth Army intended to establish the lines of departure for the attack on Bologna. They made one last attempt in November, December 1944, and the two regiments, 1st Infantry Regiment and 11th Infantry Regiment, were employed on offensive operations without the privilege of being able to accustom themselves to front line, and without the 2 weeks additional training, which originally were conceived to last for 2 months. Even if 6th Infantry Regiment did get the extra training, it was well below the original idea of 60 days. So the number of casualties was high. I don't think it was due to the fact it would have been high anyway. They made attacks against very well consolidated German positions. In the more central part of the Gothic line, the defenses were far better organized, with bunkers, well set fields of fire, more artillery. It was very different from the other two sectors they had been employed in September and October. The casualties would have been high anyway, but it did affect considerably the morale of the division, because some units, for instance, didn't get a chance to see their manuals. Every American field and technical manual was translated into Portuguese and printed in Brazil. They just look just like the same as the US manuals, but they are written in Portuguese. And not all units got their manuals. Not all units got the chance to shoot with the actual weapons which they were supposed to use. For instance, there were, even if they did have automatic rifles, yes, that's it. In Brazil, they were the French and yeah. That's exactly what I'm talking about. They did have the French and Czech automatic rifles. They knew how a squad was supposed to work. They didn't have time to shoot with the BAR, for example. There were lieutenants and other troops which received M1 carbines, and they had never handled the weapon before. So that did affect the morale, especially during the winter months. This was not the case with all regiments. With the 3 regiments, that was particularly strong among the members of 1st and 11th Infantry Regiments. So they had to overcome the situation quickly, because soon after the turn of the year, the division was to be employed in more offensive operations. And there was a severe doubt among the commanders of 4 Corps and 5th Army whether or not the Brazilians were actually capable of executing offensive operations. So it was a point of honor to show they, in fact, were able to do so. They wanted eagerly to take part. Once they had been shipped overseas, they had to grab the bull by the horns. They were already in that situation. Uh, there was no other way than to reorganize, retrain, and acquire more frontline experience and do the job they had been sent to do. Uh, I think the fact they were such such an heterodox unit, such a different unit from the rest. They were not a traditional ally. I think that contributed for us the appearance of a strong speed corps. I think the isolation, the fact they were not the subject of great confidence, helped to create. And I'm not thinking that out of my imagination. That's what I can gather from reading their trench newspapers, the memoirs, the field journals, also the interviews. But even if we restrain ourselves to the period sources, you can see there was great concern throughout all the ranks of the division about their ability to perform the job. And they
I think
counted with the help of a special training program, which was devised by a group of liaison American officers, which was conducted in January. So we can talk about that a bit later if it's necessary.
yeah, I was as you were talking, I could only think about the Battle of Monte Castello because I think that's correct if I'm wrong. It's where Brazil actually proves its efficiency in combat and achieves an objective that was extremely hard. And throughout the attacks in Monte Castello, according to my own researches, even the morale of the general, of the commander of the entire Brazilian Expeditionary Force, Mascarenhas de Moraes, falls. He also feels demoralized and concerned about the abilities of his own division. Can we talk about the Battle of Monte Castello? There are many battles, but this one stands out as one of the most important combat missions of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force.
Yes, that's why what I referred to a short while ago. It was the first combat actions in which 1st and 11th Regiment were engaged. That were the last attempts by four corps to establish the jump-off points for the spring offensive. So they tried to do it one last time in late 1944. But, Fifth Army was overall undergoing a crisis. They didn't have enough artillery ammunition reserves. They had suffered a lot of casualties. So maybe, that was one try too soon. Maybe they were thinking too much ahead of their possibilities. If you see what happened to the Brazilian division, not only the Brazilian division, but with Fourth and Second Corps during the winter, the reinforcements, the extra training, the arrival of more supplies, because the Mediterranean was a secondary theater, and we all know most of the supplies were not earmarked for that part of the operations in Europe. So a more well-conceived operation was carried out in February after the accomplishing of the training program to which the Brazilian division was subjected during January and early February. They had to correct a few, aspects of their training which were insufficient, such as how to assault bunkers, infiltration tactics, the coordination between fires of battalions, of infantry battalions and their field artillery. Once that was corrected, the ensuing operations were more, carried out more smoothly with more positive results. But even then, um, Americans lacked confidence in the offensive potential of the division. And after Monte Castello, that's what I'm talking about. That is the last attempt to take ground before the end of 1944, and which was only managed in late February. But even then, even with the missions being successfully accomplished, uh, Forecourt did not want to include the Brazilian division in the final spring offensive. They were almost, to sit out that one. They were going to be allocated once again to a secondary role to guard the flank of the major divisions which were intended to take part in the assault. And Mascarenhas de Moraes asked the commander of Forecourt to include the Brazilian division in the main operation. That was once again a sign of their high morale, their confident esprit de corps, as I said. And I don't think I can ascribe that to abstract factors. I'm talking about uh, the quality of the men that were selected. I'm talking about the fact they were isolated from their country. They had to prove themselves. And once again, I insist that these evaluations based on period sources. You can you can realize that from reading a lot of their printed materials. The division had a high rate of literate men because the army, once they wanted to select the draftees for the expedition, they wanted a set of qualities which resulted in mostly in urban origins, uh, good to excellent health conditions, and that is usually something that you can find on men who had some degree of uh, formal education. So they did write a lot. There was a lot of poetry in the trench newspapers, even if they were not allowed. There was a relatively high number of few journals, and they left a considerable amount of memoirs, which were difficult to find due to the fact, Brazil is a huge country. Men were all over on territory, and you had kind to hunt them in secondhand bookstores. Go to the reunions to see if you can find more rare book, or I'm talking about books, but a lot of them were Xerox copies of their diaries, uh, typed uh, just after they returned home. And you can realize they had, a fighting determination from their period writings. And I think all these factors uh, contributed to Mascarenhas' uh, talk with Fifth Army and Four Corps commanders so that they could take part in the final offensive, which, uh, after all, was relevant in the final operations before they reached the Po Valley, because the Brazilian division drew most of the fire in Four Corps sector, which allowed other divisions to advance more smoothly. And that information can be found also on official histories of both Fifth Army and Four Corps. And as a sign, I feel they were really, they were really determined to show they were on a par with the other divisions in Fourth Corps and Fifth Army.
It's I would like to also bring the combat in Colecchio and Fornovo because of and I would like you to talk a little bit about the capture of the 148th German division, which in my opinion is an outstanding um, achievement, for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force.
Well, that was the result of an encounter between the Brazilian vanguard and some German units which were attempting to break the encirclement of Four Corps in the latter period of the spring offensive. They were really close to the end of the war, but even then, this uh, large number of German troops tried to advance and reach northern Italy. And I don't know if they were intending to escape or at least to reach more favorable surrender conditions. But it's a fact they tried to break the Brazilian um, lines which formed around them. First with a few recon platoons from the recon troop, and then initially with a few companies from 1st Battalion of 6th Infantry Regiment, then 2nd Battalion of 11th Regiment reached then in Coleacchio, which they captured, and they realized they were facing a much larger number of troops. They initially thought it was only around 4,000 men, and when they started to negotiate with the German officers, they realized it was a division plus the remains of a few other German and Italian units, to include their initial opponents in the Serchio Valley, the men from Monte Rosa Mountain Division from the Italian Social Republic, and 148th Division as well, which had fought against them in the Serchio too. So it was not the only instance of a large amount of troops surrendering. There's a lot of myth surrounding this episode, as it's common. It's common with all World War II history, not only Brazilian division history. Uh, they did hold on and ended up capturing the German troops. It was a big feat. They consider it one of their major glories because, after so many trials, after so many difficulties they faced due to lack of training, due to the delays in the preparation of the division, it was, a happy ending after all. I have
Very good.
lots of other images which I can send to you from this episode because it's uh,
This is the
it's
classic
something that
picture.
that's a classic picture. It's one of the major episodes involving 1st Battalion of 6th Infantry Regiment, uh, which I'm writing about right now.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that in a bit. Okay. Samuel, do you wanna say anything?
Yes, I was actually a bit curious because why was the FEB sent to Italy and for instance, like not to Pacific or not to Europe?
Uh, because of the shortage of men uh, that was suffered by Fifth Army after Operation Anvil Dragoon. Fifth Army had been relieved of some divisions. Seventh Army had shipped from Italy to France to take part in Southern France invasion, and a lot of very seasoned French divisions. In fact, the more experienced divisions in mountain fighting had been committed to Operation Dragoon. As it was obvious, they were more determined to fight for the liberation of their own country than to remain in Italy. So General Mark Clark, which by September 1944 was still the commander of Fifth Army, he was eager to receive the Brazilians. He was eager to receive 92nd Infantry Division, all segregated. And he was happy and fortunate to receive as well 10th Mountain Division, which was not created for the Italian theater of operations. It was something of innovation that had been developed, but it was not a specific unit that was devised to fight in Italy. So Clark wanted to count on any kind of help he could receive. And it should also be taken into account that the U.S. Army in the second half of 1944 was suffering terrible casualties in northwestern Europe. They had to end the ASTP program. They had to ship any kind of replacements they could find to the drafty divisions, which had been engaged following the Normandy campaign. And it was in this context that the Brazilian division was welcomed by Fifth Army.
Yeah,
So
Operation Dragoon had a huge impact on the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. I learned that recently. But anyways, go ahead, Samuel.
no, I'm also a bit curious because so I know that they sent infantry soldiers. I know they sent artillery units. I also know they sent air force units. Um, at the beginning of the episode, you briefly mentioned an armored division. Was there also like an armored unit of Brazilians, and did they also fight in combat?
Well, Brazil had been using tanks since 1919 because there was a Brazilian military mission to France. Uh, a lot of
Barbados.
Brazilian field officers led French army units, especially colonial units from 1916 on, and a few of them took part in armored operations. So it was an early introduction of armor in doctrine and units in the Brazilian army. They bought a number of FT-17 tanks, and they, in 1943-44, included one armored division in the original plans of the Expeditionary Force, which actually arrived in the country. The tanks, mostly Shermans and Lees, did arrive in Brazil. They were trained, partially trained. The tanks remained here, but the division did not finish its organization. Due to several factors, which I have already mentioned, the lack of completion of its units, the difficulty of finding naval transport, and the only armored unit to take part in the division that was in fact sent was one recon squadron that was equipped with M8 Greyhounds and M3 half-tracks. That was the only kind of armor Brazilians used in Italy, although they saw frequent support of tank destroyer and tank battalions, which, though Italy is not a tank country, the Apennines are not tank country. They were very useful for infantry support operations.
All right, that's interesting. Do you want to ask anything else, Samuel?
If you have any images of this, I would be eager to
I
see them, of course.
Okay,
Yeah.
quite a lot.
Okay, I look
I can
forward
we
I
to.
can
actually
share them
Yeah,
with you.
yeah.
we when we went to the event together, me and Cesar, there we could see the Renault, the F-17. We could see the Sherman. We could see the M4 half track, I think, was also there.
The
We
Lee
could see
as well.
the Lee, yeah.
Those
Uh,
are the original tanks that were sent for the formation of the armored division.
but they're here. They never went overseas.
No, they never. The
Yeah,
division was not completed.
yeah. This is interesting. When you send me all the pictures, I will try to include in the episode, but maybe I won't be able. So I'm gonna do um, something that connects with the episode to show you all these images because I think it's extremely interesting. And keep up with our Instagrams, mine, Samuel's, and Cesar's. We're gonna put that on the description of the episode, and you can get daily World War II content. Um, one last question, and I think. Um, This is a very good one. It's been a subject of my thoughts recently, and we've been debating that, like me, Samuel, and other guests of the show. We've been talking about this. Is how did racial integration work in the Brazilian Expeditionary Force?
Well, there was not any kind of separation between origins of man. Brazil is a multi-ethnic country. You have people of several different origins, and all of them were drafted. All of the soldiers of the division uh, were typical of Brazilian ethnic composition. This is not to mean there was not any kind of racism in Brazilian society, but you know both things exist, both integration and racism. So I can elaborate on that a bit more. I think just drop this first answer and let me think on how I can better explain this subject.
I
Can you
think it
repeat the
start.
question, please?
Yeah, like how did how because okay, let's reformulate the question. You see in the American army and American society back then, they had segregation. And in Brazil, of course, we had racism, but we didn't have segregation or Jim Crow laws or anything like that. So, how did integration between white and black soldiers happened in the Brazilian Expeditionary Force? Was the color of the skin an issue for the Brazilian forces, like it was for the American forces?
Yes and no. Between the listed ranks, you can hardly notice any kind of prejudice, but it is a fact that in some representations for uh, Fifth Army and British generals, only the white men were selected, and black men were asked to sit out the parades uh, in which the division was presented to the population of Rio de Janeiro. That you can find that in a lot of memoirs, and the company commanders refused to do so. They said their answer was either the company will take part on the parade with all of its men, or it will not take part at all. So the generals, it was one general in particular. I will be discussing that in my upcoming book. Uh, he had to accept this answer, and the companies took part in the parade with their full numbers of men. Uh, it was very interesting for the Brazilians, very shocking. In fact, they were appalled to see that the U.S. Army was segregated. Uh, and the same applies to the members of 92nd uh, Division, which were surprised to see that the Brazilian Army included men of all ethnic origins in its ranks. Brazil is a multiracial society. I have uh, grandparents from all corners of the world, even though my last name is Italian. And it's a different relation to way your ethnicity is treated in other countries, maybe. And that reflected a lot in the way the Brazilian division was composed. You had a large number of you know, uh, native Brazilians from the western states. You had a lot of Germans from the southern states, a lot of Italians, immigrants from the Middle East, Jewish officers and men. Some were volunteers, others were draftees. That was very unusual at the time, especially in relation to the black and white men serving in the same platoons in the same companies. and that drew the attention of the American war correspondents, which were connected to the civil rights movement. They
That's
started
interesting.
to print news in the US about how the Brazilian army was integrated, while their own army, which was fighting for democracy, was not. Even if there was some degree of racism in Brazilian society, the integration is a strong factor which talks in favor of our more tolerant way of living.
That's super cool. I mentioned yesterday the newspapers during the interview with Molly Sampson. I mentioned the Americans writing about the mixed races in their ranks in the newspapers. But anyways, just for us to wrap it up, one last question is what happened after the war? Like just briefly explain what happened to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force after they came back from the war.
Well, most of the men returned to their civilian lives. They started right after disembarking in Brazil to form their own associations. Even as early as October 1945, they were already organizing into the local associations. Brazilians do not form their organizations according to unit, but by region, right? So each median or small size city even had its own branch of the association. The first objective of these organizations was to improve the social reintegration of the men. A lot of them came with traumas. It took a few decades until all these issues were resolved. And in the second part of their existence, these organizations dedicated themselves into preserving the memory of the campaign. They tried to, to organize their own museums, to build monuments in most small to major cities, so as to keep the memory of their participation in the war alive. And that's something that was done more successfully in some cases, uh, and in the other extreme, things finished in total oblivion. It depended on the ability of the members of each of the local association and its branches to manage to obtain the proper conditions from the local politicians in order to, achieve their goals.
I think they were pretty well, most of them were pretty successful because that's maybe why my generation talks about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force.
And
They do.
I don't think so. A lot of these associations disappeared. Um, the museums, each one of these places had its own room full with war trophies, which they called museums. Um, it's natural because it was spread all over the country, especially the southeastern parts. It would be impossible to preserve them all, but I think there are a few successful cases that's due to volunteer work nowadays done by their descendants, by some people who got engaged with the subject. Uh, but you still see a lot of monuments that have been abandoned. You know, really few relevant museums where you can find contextualized expositions and collections. But that can be ascribed to a different problem,
Yeah.
which is the precarious situations of museums in Brazil and overall. As you know,
Yeah.
our most important and oldest museum caught fire in 2019 due to lack of proper conservation. So that does not that sad situation does not only comprise the Brazilian Expeditionary Force museums. It's a more general condition.
Yeah, we have a big problem with preserving history here in our country, unfortunately. All right, so let's talk. For us just to go, let's talk about where people can find information in English about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, because that's what we're trying to do now, is to bring those stories to English language so people from other countries can read and can learn from this. Well, I'm
Well,
going to call this exotic unit that fought in the war. And Cesar has already published a book in English about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. I would like you to talk about this book you already published and about the new book that's coming up, and that people will be able to learn about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in English.
well, well, the first book to be published in English about the FPB was General Mascarenhas's campaign report. It was printed by the U.S. government printing office in 1966. It's merely a description of places and events, and with a few uh, tables comprising the history of the division. Then you have a few classical works uh, addressing Brazil and United States foreign relations, especially Frank McCann's The Brazilian American Alliance, 1937, 1945. I recommend the book to anyone who's interested in the political context of Brazil's involvement in the war. Then you have by Texas University Press a book called The Seduction of Brazil, which talks about how American soft power was a big part of the effort of convincing Brazil of joining the Allied cause. That is by Antonio Pedro Tota. Name of the book again is The Seduction of Brazil, Texas University Press. And dealing specifically with division, I have a book which I co-authored with a late friend, and which came out in 2011 as part of the Osprey Man-at-Arms series, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force 1943-45. You can easily find it online or in your local bookstore. But this is really introductory. It's only a brief description of types of uniforms. The main actions we managed to include, due to the text limitations, a few first-person accounts. And I'm working right now on a more in-depth book comprising the history of 1st Battalion of 6th Infantry Regiment, which was one of the battalions composing the first Brazilian regiment to ship overseas, which was a really interesting unit because they managed to publish a trench newspaper, their own tabloid, which was ostensibly uh, circumventing the Brazilian government censorship directives. It was very critical of uh, the way things were being conducted by the government in Brazil. It was critical of the poor services that were offered to the men of the division. For example, the postal service started to work facing a lot of difficulties. They made a lot of errors. They took too long to take the letters to Brazil and vice versa. And they all discussed this in their articles. So that was partially due to the uh, character of its commander, which was Major Gross, a man who had even fought against Vargas during one of the rebellions in the 30s. And let's see how long it takes to get published. It's already being under examination by a few publishing houses. So let's see how long it takes to finally come out. With a lot
And
of first person accounts and never before printed photos, which I have been getting even after so many years after the war's end.
It's for all
I
of
mean,
you
I'm in
listening.
contact
Yeah,
with
go
a
ahead.
few descendants, sons and daughters of veterans from this unit. So let's see what else turns up. I will share some of the pictures with you.
All right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. As we are very close, um, I'll be sharing this book a lot on my page, and as soon as we have the links for you, when it's when they publish it and it's available for buying it, you're gonna find the book in my on my page, probably on Samuel's, and we're gonna be sharing Cesar's pages because before we go. I would like to mention that Cesar runs a shop. It's an extremely nice shop. I'm wearing one of his t-shirts right now. His t-shirts have become my uniforms. I go around wearing his t-shirts as a World War II enthusiast. The t-shirts are very nice, but he also does like very authentic and good replicas of the uniforms of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. Some big reenactors like Tropa Guripa and some people from Brazil are wearing his uniforms. You can check that out. I'm going to put the link to his shop also here in the description of the episode. He ships overseas, right, Cesar?
Yes, quite often.
So, yeah.
Well, I
So,
don't think
okay.
it's necessary to mention the shop. I don't see how that, even if it's themed about the Fab, I don't think it has a lot to do with my writing. So,
Yeah, we can cut that off. No problem.
okay.
We can cut that off. Okay, so I'm going to restart from here. Okay. So, three, two, one. Okay. Just a quick reminder. Oh, thank you, Samuel. Just a quick reminder. We're all on Instagram, so be sure to follow us there. The World War II Daily underscore the World War II underscore Daily, Samuel.decorti, and CHO Militaria.
Through snow and
For
fire.
and throughs though. Yeah, yeah, okay, okay. Então vou fazer de novo. Okay, I'm gonna do it again. I'm gonna do it again. Holy cow. Okay. Can you write the time for me, Samuel, again, please? Okay, so three, two, one. Okay, before we go, a quick reminder. We are all on Instagram, so be sure you follow us there at the World War II underscore daily, Samuel.decorti, and at through snow and fire. Okay, so you can find us there for diverse and good content about World War II, besides of you getting daily World War II content. Again, if you made it this far, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the channel here. It helps a lot. Share your thoughts, suggestions, or additional information in the comments. We'd love to hear it from you. Cesar, thank you very much for dedicating your time to us today. It's a Sunday morning here in Brazil. So thank you very much. This is a very special episode to me because you're my reference when it comes down to Brazilian Expeditionary Force history. So I'm really happy to host you here in my show with my good friend Samuel. Episode 12 will be out in February, and stay tuned on our Instagram pages to see who our next guest is. Cesar, do you have any final considerations?
I'll just say thank you to you and Samuel, and keep up the good work, guys.
Thank you. We're going to do it, right, Samuel? We
Of
are
course.
working
Thank you.
hard on this. Okay. So, people, see you all on the next one. Hello there. Thank you very much for watching until the end. If you liked the video, please leave it a like. If you didn't like, unlike it and tell us in the comments how we can improve. Don't forget to subscribe because that supports us a lot. And stay tuned for more here in the World War II Daily podcast. Thank you very much. I'll see you on the next one.